I am the son of the Chinese people. I deeply love my Chinese motherland and its people. Deng Xiaoping's remarks were left for history. His life and times are China's legend, legacy, and roadmap. The extraordinary history inscribes his life with a broad range of experience, inscribes his sincere loyalty to the party and to the people, and inscribes his broad-minded wisdom and courage for the Chinese nation's great revival. This is the first time in Chinese history that people greet their leader with, "Hello, Xiaoping." The expansive Tiananmen Square is a testament to an historic moment of China. On October 1st, 1949, as one of the founders of the People's Republic of China, Deng Xiaoping appears in this picture for eternity. This would be his first time rising to Tiananmen. He has fought up and down the country with sensational achievements just for this classical time. In 1920, at the age of 16 years and worrying about the future of the nation, Deng went out of the Sichuan Valley along the river to embrace the sea. Later, while in France, he wrote of his pursuits on his resume. "I have determined to hand myself over to the Communist Party and their social class." This is the first movie clip of Deng, photographed in 1938. He was 34 and the political commissar of the 129th Infantry Division of the 8th Route Army. His Revolutionary War profession is filled with difficulty and hardship. In the summer of 1952, Deng Xiaoping, then the first secretary of the Southwest Bureau, was officially promoted to work in the party center in Beijing.
各位委员、各位同志，今天因为选举法稽查委员会主席这个周恩来同志病了，他指定我来代表选举法稽查委员会。
This is the earliest film footage with his voice. He seemed overly cautious since he just joined the party center.
全国人民代表大会及地方国际人民代表大会选举法草案的说明。
Soon, however, people became familiar with him and approved of his agile, unbiased, and honest working manner. In 1956, he was elected the General Secretary of the Party Center by the first plenary session of the 8th Party's Congress, and became one of the high-ranking members of the first-generation Central Leader Collective, of the People's Republic of China.
按照马克思列宁主义原则建立和发展起来，在实践中不断地改进自己的组织和工作，不断地加强自己同群众的联系的中国共产党，一定能够团结一致，完成人民交给我们的庄严任务。
In Mao Zedong's eyes, Deng is that rare and talented person. In November of 1957, during their visit to the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong introduces Deng to Nikita Khrushchev, saying, "You see that small guy over there? He's extremely intelligent and has a great future ahead of him. This person has both the sense of principle and flexibility," Mao added. On many occasions, Mao would especially introduce Deng to others. In 1959, the Central Committee leaders' work started to be divided into front line and second line. As the General Secretary, Deng Xiaoping worked front line. Sometimes Deng represents Premier Zhou Enlai to attend various state affair activities. Later, Deng would recall the 10 years working as Secretary General as the busiest time in his life. At that time, the Dengs lived in Hanxuan, within the party's center compound of Zhongnanhai. His life is busy, but tranquil. In 1966, at the beginning of the Great Culture Revolution, he was overthrown as a capitalist follower in the party. Not soon after, the courtyard at Zhongnanhai is no longer tranquil. Deng Xiaoping silently withstands the Red Guards entering his house, confiscating his property. They criticize and denounce him publicly. He does not show excitement or despair. As a pure revolutionary, the unusual rough experiences over more than 60 years has strengthened him dauntless. When Deng was about 30 years old, he suffered wrongful criticism and was abolished from the duty in the Jiangxi Central Chinese Soviet areas. In October of 1969, after being overthrown a second time, Deng is sent to Jiangxi with his wife and stepmother. They live in an isolated house, not far from the place he received political attack 30 years prior. In a tractor repair factory nearby, Deng resumed his earliest profession, as a mechanic, which he learned as a teen during his work-study in Paris in the 1920s. Now, however, he's an elderly 65-year-old man. During exhaustive days in Jiangxi, regardless of weather conditions, he must walk to the factory every day. Gradually, he tramples out this path. Later, people imagine that Deng Xiaoping has walked 3 years on this path, and that he thought about China's questions for 3 years. Spring arrives after 3 years of banishment. It is proposed by Mao that Deng should return to Beijing. When Mao meets Deng, he asks him how he could manage it through the years. Deng replies with a single word: waiting. China's political arena comes upon the scene surprising many people. April 11th, 1973, Deng Xiaoping appears in the welcoming line for Prince Norodom Sihanouk of Cambodia. His resurfacing becomes top of the news in both domestic and international media. Some foreign media call him an Oriental small guy who can hardly be overthrown. With the support of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping becomes the mainstay to reverse the Great Cultural Revolution turmoil. In January 1975, he simultaneously took the posts of Vice Chairman of the party's Central Committee, First Vice Premier of the State Council, Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and concurrently Chief of Staff of the Army. He begins comprehensive management of the party, the government, and the armed forces' routine work. This case is rare in New China's history. Already 71 years old, Deng Xiaoping was determined to go ahead boldly with his work. He removes all sorts of disturbances from the Gang of Four, led by Madame Mao, and thereby beginning a resolute reorganization. On many occasions, he repeatedly emphasizes the following points. We are facing many problems. To solve them, we need courage. No matter who you are, a 60-year-old tiger, a 40-year-old tiger, a 20 or 30-year-old tiger, I will grab you. As long as you work boldly, we will be responsible for the mistakes. Tens of thousands of big character posters do not scare me. Tell people I said so. The alternative is overthrow. Whose overthrow? You may ask. My overthrow. In September of 1975, the Xi'an County, Shanxi Province, hosts the National Agricultural Conference of Learn from Dazai Village, with participants from the various provinces, cities, and counties. This is a special conference during the Great Cultural Revolution. In Deng's speech on the modernizations, Deng says, "We vowed to engage in the great mission. It is truly a lofty aspiration. We can't boast. There are still some counties where grain yield is inferior to the early days of 1950s. Some farmers have little income. Some are in debt. Can we be satisfied with this sort of condition?" The reorganization in 1975 made people understand Deng Xiaoping. The popular will formed the solid foundation upon which Deng was later chosen by history. This is the last group picture with Mao Zedong photographed in May 1975. The last meeting with Mao Zedong took place on December 2nd, 1975. It is on this afternoon that he accompanies Mao to meet American President Gerald Ford. Deng's last appearance in the public eye was at the Zhou Enlai Memorial Service, where he gave the memorial speech on January 15th.
1976年1月8日9时57分，周恩来同志的心脏停止了跳动，全党、全军、全国人民都为失掉了我们的总理而感到深切的悲痛。
1976 was the year of the dragon. It is almost as if too many sorrows are concentrated in this year. That spring, Deng Xiaoping is overthrown once again. This is the third time. Afterwards, he said, "What I managed in the reorganization, in fact, opposed the Great Cultural Revolution." That enraged the Gang of Four. They once again rumbled me to get downstage. In many people's eyes, his political life had ended. He was put under house arrest in this courtyard, not far from Tiananmen. When his children saw him off, they quietly gave him poker playing cards. During this difficult period, poker was his only entertainment, and during that time, every corner of the poker deck was worn down. Later, people asked how he felt about that period. Deng simply replied, "Nothing, other than staying optimistic. If I worried every day, how could I get through?" In October 1976, along with the collapse of the Gang of Four, Deng, who maintained an optimistic point of view despite difficult situations, welcomes his political profession's magnificent years. In July of 1977, the third plenary conference of the 10th Party's Congress decides on a full restoration of Deng's former positions. Unintentionally, Deng publicly declared his position in a casual occasion. History recorded this moment that people had anticipated for a long time, and also records people's earnest hope for the future. It is not, however, an easy task for China to get moving along. After the Great Cultural Revolution turmoil, how to appraise Mao Zedong and Mao Zedong's ideology becomes a harsh topic, attracting worldwide attention. If there was not a proper reply to the topic, it would be impossible to clarify the misgivings of society to deny Mao Zedong. It would be impossible to step forward and to guarantee political stability needed for the future China. Broad-minded Deng Xiaoping demonstrates foresight and sagacity. In August of 1980, he accepts an interview request by Miss Falacci, an Italian reporter.
你已经要记下来我说的话，我是犯了不少错误的，确有不少错误的，其中包括毛泽东同志犯错误啊，有些我也有份的，说不能把过去的错都归毛主席一个人，不能这样，所以我们对毛主席的评价呀，要非常客观的。
Facing the question raised by the Western reporter, he firmly indicated the Chairman Mao's portrait on the wall of Tiananmen must hang there for generations. He said, if there was no Chairman Mao, the Chinese people would have sought in darkness for a longer time. Deng Xiaoping left this historic remark with his life.
没有毛主席，就没有新中国，这丝毫不是什么夸张。毛泽东思想培育了我们整整一代人。没有毛泽东思想，就没有今天的中国共产党，这也丝毫不是什么夸张。
The day after his retirement, Deng Xiaoping came to Zhongnanhai once again. He led his family on a visit to Mao Zedong's former residence. Walking along the familiar path, likely he recalled past events. In his mind, he was Mao Zedong's ally and would remain his student forever. After Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping continues to make history. In this crucial time to advance China, Deng Xiaoping feels historic pressure and urgency. In 1978 and 1979, Deng Xiaoping visits Japan and the United States, two industrialized countries. His understanding of modernization was that the 50s was one type, the 60s another type, and the 70s yet another. China's economy, when compared with the developed countries, had been trailing by 20 years, in some aspects by 30 years, and in some ways by 50 years. Facing such a big gap, Deng was very concerned. History alone would not present China with many development opportunities, and history did not provide Deng with much time. The urgent mood is reflected in the following conversation with a reporter while riding the new Japanese bullet train.
这就农民的宿舍吧。
これは農民の宿舎ですか？そうじゃございませんね。これは普通の 怎么样？这个成新干线以后有什么想法？
哦，就感觉到快，有催人跑的意思。我们现在正合适都这样子。
Deng, moving ahead of history, says forthrightly, when his children asked him how he went through the long march, his answer was 3 words: accompany the army. They also asked him what he did during the anti-Japanese war in Mount Taihang. He replied with 2 words: endure hardships. When he talked about the history of the Second Field Army led by Liu Bochen and Deng Xiaoping, his appraisal was only 1 word: acceptable. When one asked him about his feelings of the third overthrow, his appraisal was again 2 words: endure patiently. That is Deng Xiaoping's style, realistic and practical. In pursuit of those magnificent ideals, Deng said that he had also made hasty decisions during the Great Leap Forward movement to eliminate poverty in the 1950s. But soon he saw the reality. During the period of restoring and adjusting the national economy, Deng's famous line, "No matter if it's a yellow cat, a black cat, as long as it catches mice," was spread all over the nation with his pursuit of reality. After his third restoration, he showed his sense of humor again. In 1978, he told the people from Sichuan province, "I heard when I was in Canton that if one is a socialist, one raises 3 ducks. If one has 5 ducks, one will be capitalist." That is a strange comment. It did not matter if it was ducks or cats. He was discussing in examples. It reflected pragmatism and wisdom, using the simple language. It clearly stood for pragmatism in people's minds. In a pivotal historic moment, it is not easy to implement realistic goals. A newspaper article titled "Practice is the Sole Criterion for Truth," published in May 1978, stirred intense argument. Deng pointed out that it was ridiculous to question it. He said, "I support the point of view of the article." After Deng expressed his opinion on the article at an army conference, he went on to Northeast, Sichuan, and other provinces to explain his position to more people. When he was inspecting the Navy in Qingdao, Shandong province, Deng said, "If we do not solve our ideology problem and act realistically with open minds, it would be impossible for us to formulate a correct political policy."
目前进行的关于实践讲真理的唯一标准问题的讨论，实际上也是要不要解放思想的争论。一个党、一个国家、一个民族，如果一切从本出发，思想僵化、迷信盛行，那它就不能前进，它的生机就停止了，就要亡党亡国。从这个意义上说，关于真理标准的问题的争论，的确是个思想路线问题，是个政治问题，是个关系到党和国家的前途和命运的问题。
Seek truth from facts. Liberate our minds became the engine of China's history. It drove China roaring forward on the train of reform and openness.
我们当前以及今后相当一个历史时期的主要任务是什么？一句话，就是搞现代化建设。能否实现4个现代化，决定着我们国家的命运、民族的命运。
Deng liked to use maps. Wherever he went, he checked the maps frequently until he found the location where he was. When his vision left the maps, perhaps he paid more attention on the real position of China in the changing world.
现在要混下心来，除了战争。 始终如一的贯彻始终的就搞这件事，一切环绕着这件事，不受任何干扰。就是有战争，打了仗以后，继续干，或者要重新干。
With many issues yet to begin, China has to summon a new thinking and big efforts. The third plenary session of the 11th Party's Congress served this purpose. As the chief architect of the reform and openness, Deng Xiaoping leads the people in beginning the new Long March. In the explorations of the following years, Deng put aside arguing any matters which are not realistic. He said, "No argument. That is my big invention. We permit anything new to have a trial. If correct, we can keep it, and adjust what is not good enough. If it is wrong, we change it quickly. One thing we have to believe is, the seek the truth from facts was raised by Chairman Mao. We relied on it during the war period. We also rely on it for our current reform." In Deng's mind, there were many similarities between the reform and a battle. He called the reform the Second Revolution. To advance this revolution, a soldier's courage and resoluteness are required. In his later years, he often told foreign visitors, "I am a soldier. My specialty is war. However, I don't have any military rank." Deng Xiaoping, who had no military rank, has an inseparable bond with the troops throughout the majority of his lifetime. His first duty, after returning to China from the Soviet Union in 1926, was as political director of the Zhongshan Military School in Xi'an. His last duty was as chairman of the Central Military Commission. In his 63 years, there were fewer than 10 years when Deng Xiaoping did not have a military appointment. In the war period, Deng had a military haircut. Even after 1949, when China was taken over by the Communist Party, as the first secretary of the Southwest Bureau, he still insisted on military haircut as a role model for others upon hearing that some officers and soldiers started to lead a life of comfort by wearing longer hair once the army had entered the cities. In his later years, his walk also showed his military bearing. He kept his chin up, chest out, and never looked aside or exchanged a glance with other people. As an 80-year-old senior, he showed only one expression. No matter what happened around him, he seemed so extremely dedicated as not to be disturbed. It was as if he was emerging from the smoke of gunpowder or the flames of war.
见面不容易啊！见面不容易。这些老人呐， 好多年没有机会在一块儿见个面了。
好事。
我也不讲话了，随便聊聊天吧。
聊天。
这个日夜，只能说就是说这每个阶段呢，都完成了自己的任务，就是完成的而且比较好。你看看，联系上3万多人。
In his later years, Deng was always excited to discuss the past with his former subordinates.
我们比他还少一点。
In wartime, many times Deng Xiaoping was assigned to important missions. In 1929, when he was 25 years old, he was sent alone to Guangxi and led the famous Guangxi Uprising and became one of the founders of the People's Liberation Army. Especially unforgettable was the summer of 1947. The Liu Deng Army, following the instruction of the party center to give up the rear base, moved 300 miles to the Dabi Mountains with great risks. In the decisive Battle of Huaihai, Chiang Kai-shek's army had 800,000 soldiers, outnumbering the People's Liberation Army by 200,000. Under the leadership of the General Front Committee, chaired by Deng Xiaoping, the People's Liberation Army finally beat Chiang's army. Hazardous military life tempered Deng Xiaoping and developed his high moral character, so he could bravely pick up heavy burdens, dare to struggle, and make policy decisively. Depending on this strength, the Liu Deng army developed Mount Taihang Base, boldly moved into the Dabi Mountains, fought the decisive Battle of Huaihai, crossed the Yangtze River, and commanded the army to the southwest, with victories one after another. Depending on this kind of moral character, in the Great Culture Revolution's years, he resolutely carried on with the reorganization, experimented boldly to map out a new road for China. It is through this personality that during his later years he found a rejuvenating way for the nation. On the new Long March, Deng stepped forward firmly and never missed any opportunities. Not suitable to delay. Please do not delay. Cannot delay. Delay is not the right way. Such written comments on the documents always can be found in Deng's writing, expressing his urgent and innermost feelings. To assure there were no delays, Deng resolutely applied skills he used in the war to make strategic decisions on important measures for the reform and openness. In April of 1979, when he made the decision to set up a special economic zone, he used the war expression, "Fight a bloody struggle for a new road." This expression came from a veteran. One could foresee the struggle for reform and openness. How magnificent it would be to establish an unprecedented special economic zone. In spring of 1984, Deng came to Shenzhen. He told people the special zone was his idea. He would come to find out how it had turned out. He saw a new city rising from the ground. He listened carefully and thought seriously, but spoke no words until he was leaving Shenzhen. He gave only a short remark, but it meant a lot. The progress in Shenzhen bears witness to the correctness of the special economic zone policy. To make a resolute decision does not mean to act aimlessly. The process of reform requires continuous practice and innovation. In the summer of 1979, the 75-year-old Deng Xiaoping visits the Yellow Mountains in Anhui Province, where many farmers still hesitate to adopt the household farming system, which was part of the agrarian reform. Deng's strategy was not to argue, not to force anyone to do it. Waiting and seeing were allowed, in order to test the system in certain villages and then gradually pursue it throughout the whole state. Reform in rural China thus passed this hurdle. Still, in 1979, when Deng met with foreign visitors, he put forward an astonishing subject. Why can't socialism have a market economy? After over 10 years of exploration, China finally established a socialist market economy system, which became the most outstanding page of China's reform. It is Deng Xiaoping who is not only capable of designing a plan, but also knows how to implement it. People believe it is related to his skill at playing the card game of bridge. Playing at bridge, Deng Xiaoping defended tightly, attacked ruthlessly, called accurately, and played steadily. Regardless of his being in the lead or falling behind, he displayed a consistent bearing. The principles of bridge lay in planning the operation and in the strategic judgment. Premier Zhou Enlai once said, Deng Xiaoping's leadership style was lifting a heavy weight as if it were light. Deng, who lifted heavy weight as if it were light, frequently said, "My method is to pay special attention to the leaders and the policies." In 1986, American reporter Mike Wallace interviewed Deng Xiaoping. He asked Deng how much time he spent working every day. Deng's reply was 2 hours. This reply surprised Mr. Wallace, and he lifted 2 fingers, wondering if he was wrong. That made Deng Xiaoping burst into laughter. No wonder the reporter was surprised. Navigating the great nation of China, how could 2 hours a day be sufficient for him? The family members remember, although Deng Xiaoping spoke less before making some significant decisions, he would always think in his mind all day long. As soon as they saw him lying on the sofa with his legs sitting on the stool silently, they no longer disturbed him because he was deliberating an important matter. In 1982, at the opening ceremony of the 12th Party's Congress, Deng Xiaoping put forward a profound historical conclusion, obtained after some deep thinking.
把马克思主义的普遍真理同我国的具体实际结合起来，走自己的道路，建设有中国特色的社会主义。这就是我们总结长期历史经验得出的基本结论。
It is precisely this conclusion that has caused socialism to be magnificent again in China, and has resulted in China's bright prospect. Are the people satisfied? Are the people happy? Do the people approve? Do the people support? Deng Xiaoping asked these simple but powerful questions.
第一步就本世纪末了，达到小康水平，就是不穷不富的日子很好过的社会。第二步，再用30-50年的时间，在经济上接近发达国家的水平，使人民生活比较富裕，这是一个大局。
He never forgot the well-off society goal he proposed. This was a summer evening in 1980s. Deng Xiaoping suddenly appeared at the Lantern Festival in the park in Beijing. In the crowd, he walks around and looks with enthusiasm, like an ordinary citizen. By staying close to ordinary life, Deng Xiaoping felt people's happiness and their demands, and recognized changes in Chinese society. During his traveling in Suzhou in 1983, when he learned that the local lifestyle was almost at a well-off level, he was excited. After he returned to Beijing, he used jubilant to describe his feeling to several central leaders in charge. In 1987, Deng Xiaoping for the first time proposed in detail the Chinese modernization as 3 steps. The first step is solving the lingering and copious problems of the 1980s. The second step is to accelerate to the well-off standard of living by the end of the 20th century. The third step is to achieve the level of economic development as the moderately developed countries in the middle of the 21st century. Deng Xiaoping said, "These are our lofty aspirations and high ideals. Although I will not live to see this, I have the responsibility to set the goal." How would the Chinese people live when they were approaching the level of a well-off society? Practical Deng Xiaoping had his ideas on this. As early as 1980, his proposed tentative plan had already been generally realized after 20 years. He said, the city inhabitants in the future would be allowed to purchase their own houses. New-built houses would be for sale, and buyers would be allowed to either pay money in full or by installments. He also said, newly built housing must have proper plumbing and amenities to let people take a bath at home after work. Seeing some new houses with an old-style padlock, he would say, "Is this to tell a thief there is nobody home?" On that night, the 15th day of Lunar New Year in 1992, Deng Xiaoping appeared on crowded Nanjing Road in Shanghai and went to the stationery counter of the Shanghai First department store. He took out money and bought a dozen pencils and erasers for his grandchildren. He said, "The pencil encourages the children to study well, and the erasers remind the children to correct mistakes." That evening, he also toured the Huangpu River, which had changed greatly. In 1992, Deng came to visit the Shenzhen Botanical Garden. When he saw an unfamiliar tree, he curiously asked what it was. Someone told him that the locals call it get-rich tree. His daughter said jokingly, "Later, our family will also plant one." Deng Xiaoping then earnestly replied, "Let all the people plant one. Let's all get rich." To let the whole nation all get rich is Deng Xiaoping's strongest wish.
鼓励一部分地区、一部分人先富裕起来，也正是为了帮助越来越多的人富裕起来，达到共同富裕的目的。
After retirement, he repeatedly stressed, to become all rich, which we said at the start of the reform, will become the central topic someday in the future. Socialism is not a minority being rich and a majority poor. No, it's not like that. He also proposed a schedule to resolve the question of wealth for everyone. He said, when we achieve the well-off economic level in the end of this century, it is then that we must prominently raise and solve this question. Led by Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese are exploring and practicing socialism with a distinct Chinese characteristic. It is this socialism that takes economic development as a center, persists in the four fundamental principles, and persists in the reform and openness policy. It is this socialism that unceasingly makes its contribution to humanity's peace and development.
Do you mind if I smoke?
I cannot say no to you because I am not the leader of this country.
我不能对您说不能抽，因为我不是这个国家的领导人。
But in the Philippines, for cabinet meetings, no smoking.
但是在菲律宾，我们内阁开会不许抽烟。
这是人大我违反那个规则，就是我习惯拿起一支烟来，就有个代表递条子，那个提出批评，马上只好接受，没办法。
Smoking has been a habit since Deng Xiaoping was young. On the way of the Long March, he and his comrades could only make themselves leaf cigarettes to satisfy a craving for tobacco. During the 50s and 60s, he and many party Central Committee leaders were all tenacious smokers. Even though it was a central conference, they would all tolerate heavy smoke to discuss national affairs. When meeting with foreign guests, smoking enhances a kind of relaxed and free feeling. In such a relaxed atmosphere, Deng Xiaoping's calm and wisdom made a profound impression among many foreign friends. During the Sino-Japanese wartime, American military officer Evans Carlson met Deng Xiaoping. He described Deng's mind as keen-edged as a sharp mustard. His extraordinary manner made the foreign leaders who had met him refer to him as a heavyweight boxer. Twice he was chosen by Western media's Time magazine as Man of the Year. He created a peaceful and stable international environment for China's modernization. In 1974, he led the Chinese government delegation in attending the United Nations General Assembly Special Conference. This was Deng Xiaoping's first visit to a Western country following Paris in 1925. His arrival received special attention from the various countries' diplomats. The world rostrum, after more than 30 years of history, advanced the Chinese government leader's voice for the first time.
主席先生，从国际关系的变化看，现在的世界实际上存在着互相联系。
In his lecture, Deng Xiaoping comprehensively elaborated on Mao Zedong's Three Worlds theory. This was China's basic judgment on the world pattern at the time. During a draft discussion, Deng Xiaoping added the following.
中国现在不是，将来也不做超级大国。如果中国有朝一日变了颜色，变成一个超级大国，也在世界上称王称霸，到处欺负人家、侵略人家、剥削人家，那么世界人民就应当给中国戴上一顶社会帝国主义的帽子，就应当揭露他、反对他，并且同中国人民一道打倒他。
These warm, friendly hands let him feel the changes of the world's circumstances and also pull China closer to the world. Five years later, Deng Xiaoping once again traveled across the ocean and arrived in the United States. Not long before, he led the negotiations on establishing diplomatic relations between the two nations. The bilateral announcement stated January 1st, 1979, as the official date of the newly established diplomatic relations. At the discussion table, someone asked Deng Xiaoping, "When we initially decided to normalize mutual relations, did you have any domestic political opposition?" Deng Xiaoping decisively replied, "Yes." That surprised the people around the table. He then continued at a moderate pace. In China's one province, Taiwan, we met with intense opposition. American President Jimmy Carter accompanied Deng Xiaoping in watching a live performance organized by the Kennedy Center at the Performing Arts. When the performance ended, Deng Xiaoping stepped onto the stage and kissed the children who sang the Chinese songs. President Carter wrote in his diary, he kissed many children. Some in the audience were moved to tears. A conservative Republican senator who was in vigorous opposition to the Sino-American relations normalizations, said after this performance, he had lost. During his visit, more than 2,000 reporters participated in his activities. ABC, CNN, and CBS television networks' evening prime time became the Deng Xiaoping time. Several hundred congressmen, the officials, and celebrities from all walks of life met Deng Xiaoping. Several thousand people directly listened to his lectures. The American public understood in a direct way the standpoint China held towards international affairs and Sino-American relations. Deng let the world hear his own voice, and at the same time, he also earnestly and respectfully listened to the voices coming from the rest of the world. It was this kind of exchange and striking together that Deng Xiaoping held a new view of the world's circumstances. In the mid-1980s, Deng Xiaoping keenly realized the whole world was seeking peace and development. He said, peace and development were global issues. Peace was the East-West, or lateral issue, while development was the North-South, or vertical issue. Deng summarized it in 4 words: East, West, and South-North. The South-North was the core issue. Lift heavy weight as if light. Hold the essence. The complex issues of international situations seemed like a big mess. In Deng's eyes, however, it is so simple.
为我的朋友、博士，为在座的美国朋友，为中美两国之间合作的关系的发展的友好。
At the banquet, Deng Xiaoping is straightforward.
And Mr. Chairman, you have brought about historic transformations in your country.
Drink a toast, all of us.
听完了没有？让我们举杯。
After clinking glasses with visitors and finishing his wine, he sometimes follows a Chinese custom by showing his empty wine glass.
您所做的一切就保证改革呢将会进入下一个10年。
With such a big cup of Chinese hard liquor, Deng Xiaoping handles it easily.
We trust you, Mr. Chairman.
American President George Bush thought it was inconceivable.
Propose a toast
邓主席，我们相信您，并且我
to the
建议
Sino-American relation.
From his frank behavior, it's likely the visitors felt his style of trustworthiness and resolve to keep a promise. In August 1982, he said to United Nations Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar, China understands its responsibility. There are two rules on which everybody is clear. One is persisting in principle. The other is keeping a promise. Personally, my hobby is playing bridge, but in government matters, China does not like playing cards. To maintain world peace and devotion to the economic development were China's two invariable pursuits. In June 1985, on the same day when the World Peace Conference convened in Beijing, Deng announced the million-person disarmament decision at the expanded meeting of the Central Military Commission. He also said, improve the economy first, and all else will be easy. China's million-person disarmament sprinkled the light of peace onto the international political stage and paved the way for the People's Liberation Army to become the crack troops and modernize state defense. In 1989, Deng Xiaoping met former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in Beijing. Before the formal meeting, Deng set a rule. There would be no hugs, only handshakes in the courtesy ceremony and photo opportunity. It indicated to the world that both countries could not return to form an alliance relationship as before. They would establish new diplomatic relations with equality. In their discussion, he put forward the policy of processing bilateral relationship as finishing the past and opening for the future. Regardless of whether this closed the past or opened the future, in Deng's heart, there was an incomparable and serious balance struck that would benefit and firmly maintain the nation's dignity. In 1982, he discussed the Hong Kong question with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. When British negotiators thought that the three unequal treaties were still effective and proposed a plan to trade the sovereignty by governing power, Deng Xiaoping replied decisively and loudly.
主权问题是不能够谈判的，就是说中国啊，1997年收回的问题啊是不能谈判。 不管用什么方式，谈判的题目就是一个归属问题。一个我们根本谈不拢，中国将考虑接收香港的时间和方式。
He also said, if we do not take back Hong Kong, that would mean Chinese government is still the late Qing government. The Chinese leader is Li Hongzhang. As the plot to divide the motherland attempted by the Taiwan independence influence, he expressed firm confidence from a strategic point of view to maintain China's unity.
用和平方式解决台湾问题，但是我们不能放弃用非和平的方式统一台湾的这个承诺。一个台湾当局远远不跟我们谈判，怎么办？难道我们放弃国家统一？但是这个绝不能够轻易使用，但是不排除使用武力。我们要记住这一点，这算是一种战略的考虑。
In the last century, at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, along with Soviet Union's disintegration and with Eastern Europe's drastic change, the world structure went through a historic transition. Deng explicitly proposed corresponding strategies, that of calm observation, standing firmly on its feet, dealing with the issues steadily, and to continue its achievements. He repeatedly expressed that no matter how the international situation had changed, the key was that one must handle his own issues. To handle one's own issues, one should focus on the future. Starting in 1979, under Deng Xiaoping's initiative, China celebrated Arbor Day. On Arbor Day each year, he always took his grandchildren with him. At the beginning, the granddaughter looked to the side. And then she and her grandfather began to work with one shovel. Spring breezes and autumn rain. Year by year, the tree grew tall, as did the child. Deng said, "A person who handles state affairs must focus on the long-term consequences of any issue. Long-term is the future, and the future belongs to the next generation." Whether on domestic inspections or on overseas visits, he never conceals his affection for children. In February 1983, he paid a visit to the Buddhist temple in Hangzhou. He could not help touching one child's small face in the crowd. He also asked the child's name. The next day, at the bank of the West Lake, Deng bumped into this child again. The 80-year-old Deng recalled her name without hesitation. Afterwards, the sweet picture was taken. In Deng's eyes, children are the hope and the future. He said, "Computer literacy must begin with children." He said, "Soccer must begin with children." He said, "Education must begin with children." Beginning with children means to focus on the future and focus on the long term. Many people who have already entered into their later years perhaps still remember the red-hot times of the 1950s, remembering Deng Xiaoping shouting, "Long live the youth."
我们确信，这一代青年绝不会辜负党和人民的期望，一定能够无愧于伟大的中国人民革命事业的继承人，一定能够在社会主义建设事业中不断地取得新的成绩。为社会主义而奋斗的青年万岁！
As China emerged from the shadow of the Great Cultural Revolution, an entire generation had already said goodbye to their youth during the years of upheaval. The country had a serious manpower shortage, and yet China had to modernize. What would drive its modernization? In May of 1977, prior to Deng's restoration, Deng Xiaoping started to think of this question. He said, "After I go back to work, I must first stress science and education." After resurfacing, his first significant action was to immediately restore the college entrance examination system. In the new China's history of education, there was one group of special university students. Among them, some were over 30. Some were married. Some of them had become fathers or mothers. It was an elder's decision that brought them another youth. At the same time, China started to send students overseas at the government's expense. Then, China began Teachers' Day, as Deng had proposed. Face the world, face the future, and face the modernization became an exacting development strategy for China's education. In March of 1978, more than 6,000 scientists gathered in Beijing. China's science and technology infrastructure welcomed its own growth.
为了把科学研究工作搞上去，还必须做好后勤保障工作，为科学技术人员创造必要的工作条件，这也是党委的工作内容。我愿意当大家的后勤部长。
Respect for science and respect for talent result in enormous liberation of society's productive capabilities. 8 years later, on March 3, 1986, 4 renowned scientists present a proposal to track high-tech development. This document was delivered to Deng Xiaoping's desk. The next day, he added this written comment. This proposal needs to be a fast resolution. Do not delay. In the fall of 1988, Deng Xiaoping visited the Beijing Electron Reactor Laboratory. He emphatically signed his name on the visitor logbook. He walked along the long corridor around the reactor in the lab. He stopped at each essential spot. He listened to the scientists, explained for him. He earnestly listened. His facial expression was very concentrated. Deng may not be clear as to how the reactor worked. Not long before, he put forward his judgment that science and technology was his first priority, because he knew what high-tech would mean for China.
过去也好，今天也好，将来也好，中国这么一个国家呀，必须在高科技领域里边有一席之地。如果60年代我们没有原子弹，没有发射卫星，中国的现在是能不能叫3个大国？有没有这样的地位？因为这些东西啊，是反映一个民族的这个能力，也是一个民族啊，一个国家兴旺发达的标志。
He is always the elder who is looking toward the future. In 1992, when he visits Zhuhai, he learns that two systems were designed by adopting the world's newest technology. He was very happy and said repeatedly, "We must develop high technology. The newer the better. We will be happy. The people will be happy. The entire country will be happy." Deng Xiaoping had an ear infection when he was young. As a result, his left ear hearing had gradually ceased. In official situations, he frequently used a hearing aid. Hearing was somewhat improved. In his later years, when he met foreign guests, he always broke the convention that the host is supposed to sit at the left side and he at the right. Foreign guests saw that, although Deng's hearing was not strong, his mind was extraordinarily keen.
As long as you do not.
American former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had this feeling. When he met Deng Xiaoping, he said to Deng, "In China, I know you are one of the eldest statesmen, but I do not know anyone else whose mind is younger than yours."
And genuine friends.
Yes, we both believe very much.
In 1988, Deng met with Norwegian Prime Minister Madame Gro Harlem Brundtland. There was an interesting moment. The interpreter had incorrectly translated Deng's age to her as 48 years old instead of 84 years old, giving everyone in the room a good laugh. The 84-year-old Deng's mind, indeed, was as active and as young as a 48-year-old. Because his mind was young, he could look further.
今天恐怕是讲的对我们高级干部来说啊，不是那么很愉快的一些话。现在我们国家面临的一个危机，真正的危机，就是我们要搞4个现代化呀，没有一批严复力强的、有专业知识的干部，这点我们要清醒地估计到，否则我们搞实话会只变成喊口号的。老同志要让啊，要认真地选接班人，这是个百年大计，是我们一个战略问题，要有国有民啊，有党啊。
He even joked, "If we do not solve this in a satisfactory way, when we see Karl Marx, we would not be able to hand over a very acceptable report." In 1992, the 12th Party's Congress wrote an important chapter in the comprehensive retirement of elder members. Of the 348 members of the Central Committee, 211 were newly elected. That year, the party's Congress gave birth to a new organization called the Central Advisory Council. Deng was elected as this council's first director. At the Central Advisory Council's first plenary session, he made it clear that this was only a transitional organization, and finally, we should establish the retirement system. Three years later, a group of old prestigious members were retired on their own initiative from the Advisory Council. To thank those old members, Deng Xiaoping and some of the central leaders gave a special banquet in honor of the retired members. That day, Deng was very happy and drank, in a row, 5 shots of hard liquor to commemorate the occasion. From 1980, Deng frequently spoke of his desire to be retired as soon as possible. He at first hoped that he could be retired in 1985. He also tried to convince people to agree to his retirement on the 13th Party's Congress in 1987. Both requests were not accepted by the party's Central Committee. As a party member, all he could do was the party's bidding. He clearly understood that it was dangerous to establish a national destiny based on the prestige of one or two individuals. He was determined to complete his retirement wish while his mind was still sound. He told the people, "My final function is to take the lead and establish the retirement system." In 1989, the fourth plenary conference of the 13th Party's Congress elected Jiang Zemin as General Secretary of the Central Committee. Under Deng Xiaoping's management, the party's third-generation Central Leader Collective was established. In September of that year, he wrote this sort of letter to the Central Political Bureau. "After my careful consideration, I want to take advantage of my current healthy condition and resign from the current duty to realize my long-awaited wish. This will be beneficial to the party, the nation, and Army enterprises. I sincerely hope the Central Committee will accept my request." An auspicious snow marked the beginning of that year's winter, covering the wilderness of northern China. On November 9th, he took his usual walk in the morning. He circled around his courtyard 18 times, then read his documents. At that time, the Great Hall of the People, not far away, was holding the fifth plenary session of the 13th Party's Congress. Getting out of bed after the midday nap, he quietly awaited the news he had anticipated for so long. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Central Committee plenary session agreed to Deng Xiaoping's resignation.
一句话，感谢同志们的理解和支持，全会接受了我退休的请求。衷心地感谢全会，衷心地感谢同志们。
That day, when he returned home, his family prepared a celebration ceremony. A big cake, a blessing, a greeting card. 1922, the year he joined the revolutionary ranks. 1989, the year he retired. And forever, best wishes, forever a soldier, forever a revolutionary, and forever a young elder. The first Lunar New Year's Eve, after he retired, Deng had the children around him, just as other elders full of descendants do, to leisurely enjoy watching China Central TV's Spring Festival Gala. This is one big happy family. Whenever the family reunited, even though Deng does not like photographs, he was willing to allow his kids to organize a harmonious, happy family picture. The first picture of this family was taken in 1939, when Deng Xiaoping and Zhuo Lin were married in Yan'an. In spring of 1966, Deng visited Yan'an again. He specifically went to Yangjiling, where he and Zhu Ling wedding ceremony was held in front of the cave dwelling where Mao Zedong lived. Soon after the wedding party, the husband was going to the battlefront. the young wife asked her husband to assure her that he'd write to her frequently. Deng said to his wife, "Okay, I'll write one, and let the secretary copy dozens. I'll send you a copy every month." In his wife's eyes, Deng was not a very romantic husband, but the sincere and loving concern between the couple made her believe that Deng was a sincere and genuine husband. In the children's eyes, he was a good and ordinary old man. His grandchildren were a treasure in Deng's heart. With the children, he was always satisfied. With that kind of satisfaction, one gets when enjoying his family's happiness. Deng loved life and loved nature. In his courtyard there were peony, fragrant plantain lily, Chinese rose, and Chinese herb peony. Each season there were always flowering blossoms. When the children asked him which flower he liked the most, he replied, "Chinese herb peony, because it is not only attractive, but it is also used as raw material for medicine." Connecting his daily life sentiments with application is Deng's unique appreciation of the fine arts. Deng was also a real sports enthusiast. He paid a great deal of attention to sports news. He was never too tired to watch televised sports programs. When a Chinese team won, he clapped with joy. If it was a gymnastics or diving competition program, he would call the scores like a game judge, usually giving the higher scores to young Chinese athletes. Deng was a huge fan of soccer. Once, a long time earlier, when he worked and studied in France in the 1920s, he pawned his coat for 5 francs so that he could watch an exciting international soccer game there. With this money, he bought the cheapest ticket. In his later years, he still remembered that it was the Uruguayan team that won the match. Once retired, he could watch sports games more frequently. In 1990, China Central TV transmitted 52 sessions of the World Cup soccer game. He did not miss a single one. After retirement, his biggest desire was to travel about like common people. During his lifelong explorations, Deng's trail could be tracked all over China. The brilliant civilization, the grand landscape, and the various multicolored nations' customs all blended into his special mood. In China, he still had several places where he had not yet visited. Those places always haunted him. In February 1978, on the journey to visit Nepal in his special plane, he looked down on the snow-covered Tibet with deep feeling. Tibet, a mysterious land, was liberated without fight by the army led by Liu Boqing, He Long, and Deng Xiaoping. But Deng had never gone to Tibet. This became a major regret in his later years. In 1992, when he visited the Miniature China Museum at Shenzhen, he saw Potala Palace. Deng said, "In this life, I won't visit Tibet. Let's take a photo in front of this Potala Palace as a commemoration." He sat on the revolving sightseeing platform in the Shenzhen International Trade Building and cast his vision on a misty Hong Kong. That was also a place he dreamed about. Deng proposed the great concept of one state with two systems. It laid the solid foundation for the Chinese government to successfully solve the Hong Kong and Macau issues. The five-starred red flag rose on the lands that were invaded and occupied by the Western colonialists a century ago. The concept of one state with two systems had originally been proposed to solve the Taiwan problem. He also wanted to have a look at Taiwan. He once said to the foreign guests, "There is only one thing left in my life. That is the Taiwan problem. Perhaps I would not see the solution in my time." However, he did not believe that this narrow strait of seawater could become a heartfelt suffering pain for the Chinese people forever. As a great patriot, Deng cared most about the Chinese nation's undertaking revival. In 1992, Deng came to Shenzhen again. Different from his last visit 8 years prior, he was much older, but the special zone had been matured and changed into a shining metropolitan city. Differing from his last visit, he went everywhere and talked to everybody. From him, people heard the following remark: "If we had not taken the risks, if we lacked the courage, we could not have developed along the right path." Be brave, liberate your mind, walk with faster steps. Such words transmitted the senior's sense of urgency. It was as though this senior would like to exchange his remaining life for the youth of the nation. It was in his last 20 years that he played out the most brilliant part of his life. That year, he was 90 years old. He steadily stood in the cold wind on the under-construction Nanpu Bridge in Shanghai, as if he was listening attentively to the footsteps of passing years, listening to the sound of the tide of reform and openness. He looked, listened, and could not help saying, "Look at today's road merrily, better than reading for 100 years." His daughter beside him said, "For 40 years, I have never heard that you could write a poem." He replied emotionally, "This is not a poem. This is my innermost feeling." Perhaps on China's road to revival, he heard his own composed, non-rhyming poem. Deng likes swimming in the ocean. When he was 16 years old and seeking the key of hope, he left his Sichuan home to embrace the sea. Thereafter, He acted as a vanguard, assaulting the great ocean waves of his life. The tide of time granted him with eternal brilliance, and made his mind and heart like the generous and humble sea. In the fall of 1993, the retired Deng Xiaoping had a lengthy conversation with his younger brother. Since leaving home at 16, he had never returned to the hometown again, and there were few meetings with his brother. This time, they discussed a lot. They talked about the hometown, talked about their mother, and Deng was excited, saying, "The country has been developed. I will be happy to be a regular citizen of a wealthy country." He also said, "Do not excessively highlight my individual career and achievements. What I did just reflected Chinese people's desire and a Chinese communist desire."